Welcome to the Coach Doctor podcast, a podcast where we discuss aspects of sports coaching from grassroots to grandstands. I'm your host, James Barkell, and on this podcast, we hear from academics who research coaching. We talk to coaches on the front line from development levels through to professional coaches, and we discuss other elements of successful sporting programs with experts and practitioners from a range of sports science fields, motivational psychology, strength and conditioning, and many other elements required for successful performance. If you'd like to know more about what we do at the Coach Doctor, you can visit our website, thecoachdoctor.com.au, and learn more about our services, or follow me on Instagram at thecoachdr or Twitter at James_Barkell for more regular information. Today we have Dr. Marcus Hannon on the podcast. Marcus is the current lead performance nutritionist at the Qatar Football Association. He has previously worked as a sports nutritionist in the English Premier League, with professional boxers and in professional rugby union clubs. There is a little backstory to Marcus and I, as I first met Marcus way back in 2010 when he came out to Sydney on his gap year at the school where I was teaching physical education. We then bumped into each other out of the blue in Melbourne in 2018 at the World Congress of Science and Football, where Marcus and I were both presenting. So it's a very small world. And Marcus, it's great to have you on the podcast, mate.
Yeah, James, it's well, first, thanks for having me on. And who would have thought back in Sydney in 2010 would be here, 14 years later, but here we are.
Marcus, just quickly, are you able to give us a brief history of the organisations you've worked for in the past and what sort of roles you've held within each organisation?
Yeah, so I guess like most people working in sport, certainly within the performance side of things, after I did the year in Sydney with you, went to university, did undergraduate, master's, PhD in the area of sports nutrition. Few years of sort of voluntary placements and internships, if you like, within football, within rugby, various settings there. And my first paid role was a maternity cover with Ulster Rugby within the academy there. So that was my first paid gig within sports nutrition. I then went to Everton Academy, so Everton Football Club within the Premier League. And I was the academy nutritionist there. So that was 2016, and that was Everton's first full-time nutrition setup. So I came into the academy on a full-time basis. There was a practitioner, Lloyd Parker, came into the first team. And then we had a consultant, Professor Graham Close, who was in. So Lloyd and I were both full-time. Graham was part-time, and the three of us sort of set up a new nutrition program across the club. I spent just nearly 3.5 years at Everton, which was brilliant. First nutrition setup there, and really my first big project I got my teeth into within sport nutrition. I spent a year with Northampton Saints rugby union team, who have just won the Premiership there. A historic English club. Spent a year there, and that was my first exposure to the senior environment. So I was working with the seniors and the academy, but 90% of my work was done with the senior squad there. After that, I then went to Aston Villa Football Club. So back into football as head of nutrition at Aston Villa. And in similar fashion to Everton, it was Villa. Prior to me, Aston Villa had consultants on a part-time basis in the years preceding me. But it was new ownership, new performance director, and they wanted a full-time nutrition program. So I was brought in as the head of nutrition for the club, and basically to set up mainly service the first team, but set up a nutrition department across the club and bring in staff and set up new systems and structures. So that was really, really cool gig. I had COVID sort of towards the start of that time, so that was challenging, but really enjoyable experience all the same. And then I've been out in Qatar nearly 2 years now. So initially I came out, my role here was a dual role. So it was sort of oversee Aspire Academy, which is the feeder academy into the, well, so I oversee the football side of things. So Aspire as the feeder into the Qatar Football Association pathway. So it was initially to come out and oversee Aspire Academy and the QFA pathways. Sort of it's sort of two organizations under the same umbrella, if you like. Quite soon after I started, I was then there was a new manager. He wanted me more with just the Qatar national team, first national team. So that job has recently split into two parts. So I now oversee the Qatar Football Association, first team and pathways. And we brought someone else in to oversee the Aspire pathway, feeder pathway. So, so that's been here 2 years, but it's flowing in. When I started, there was two of us. We've just employed a sixth person. So that's quite a unique role. We can maybe talk more about it later. I'm not sure, but you've got the Qatar Football Association, first national team at the top, and then Aspire Academy starts at under 13. So you've got 13 to 18 within Aspire, 6 teams of about squads of about 30, and then you have under 17s, 20s, 23s first national team within the Qatar setup. So one very much feeds into another, but nutrition's quite a young discipline out here. Nutrition's quite a young discipline within sport, but particularly in these parts in the Middle East, it's really very new.
You mentioned throughout your history, you started off doing some voluntary work and some internships with clubs. How important did you find that to get the experience to sort of get to where you are now, working with international teams and having experience working with Premier League teams and so forth?
Yeah, so I did three sort of voluntary placement internships, if you like. The first one of that was I did my undergraduate degree in Oxford Brookes University. So Oxford United were the local football team, and they were League Two at the time. So the fourth tier of English football, but still professional. So what I did was in my final year of my degree, a few conversations and a few cups of coffee, and I ended up going down there once a week, and that was just helping out where I could, jack of all trades, doing hydration tests, and helping out with supplements, helping out in the gym, putting away weights, taking CMJ measures, just anything I could do. I was getting involved in. I then did actually, after my undergraduate degree, I went back to Belfast for a year with the idea of saving up for a master's. So moved back in with my parents, worked in a bar in the evenings, bar restaurant. But during the day, I did 1 year, full time, unpaid with Ulster Rugby. And again, I always knew I wanted to move into nutrition, but at that time there wasn't great sport nutrition jobs. There weren't a lot of, certainly within the UK and Northern Ireland. So an opportunity came up to be an S&C coach for a year, a voluntary sort of S&C coach, and help out within the academy program within Ulster Rugby. So I did that for a year, helped out with local schools, strength and conditioning, and then also within the academy at Ulster. Now, whilst that wasn't nutrition directly, it got me exposure and a better understanding of S&C, more exposure to professional rugby, professional sport. And then the year I did with my masters, there was a placement throughout that year, and I did that with Wasps Rugby down in London, again with their academy. So probably 3 years worth of unpaid work, but it gave me, had I not done that, I wouldn't have got that first paid job within Ulster, because you needed to understand the environments, you needed to have exposure, you just understand how the things operated and work. So look, it can be a tricky one, and I know it can rub some people up the wrong way. People shouldn't be working for free, and I did 3 years unpaid. I'm glad I did it. I'm glad I went through it, and it made me want to get, confirm that I want to sort of choose this pathway. Whereas I think some people nowadays, it's such a competitive industry, performance sport, and particularly performance nutrition. It almost sorts the wheat from the chaff, in terms of who really wants to do it.
what I've heard from speaking to people and my own experiences, sometimes you learn a lot more on the job in those early years when you're volunteering or you're earning next to nothing and doing those sorts of roles. You actually learn a lot more than you learn throughout your degrees and stuff like that. So you sort of learn the ins and outs of things and the application a little bit more of some of the detail. So often you can be exposed to things that you weren't that sure of, and you build up that experience, you build up that knowledge, and yeah, it can like it obviously did for you. It can propel you into some pretty big roles for the future. So it sounds great that you had those opportunities to do that, and then obviously go from there. Where you've been working in the past and where you're working now, probably like you said, may not have happened had you not done those 3 years prior.
Yeah, 100%. I mean, it wouldn't have happened first and foremost, but I wouldn't have been ready for, you can't expect to say in nutrition, a master's is pretty much standard now if you want to work within sport nutrition. Within the UK, there's a board called a voluntary register called Sport and Exercise Nutrition Register. So most teams, organizations now, you have to be on this Sport and Exercise Nutrition Register. And to do that, you pretty much need a master's. But even at masters, coming out the back of my masters, I got that job with Ulster. I wouldn't have been ready for that job had I not had those few years experience. And every job has given me something. I've taken something from every job to then go on to what you could say is perceived to be a next step in the career pathway. So yeah, certainly one has fed into each other.
Yeah, fantastic. And obviously, working in the Premier League would have been amazing. You started off with Everton at the academy level, as you mentioned, and you set up a program there. But then later on, you went to Aston Villa and you were working with first team players in the Premier League. What was that like?
Well, I guess going into Everton, so it's a Premier League club, but I was in the academy, so it was quite nice in the fact that I got a very, very good understanding of how it run, how it operated. I was in it, but not in it. I could see what was in the club, was working with first team staff, not every day, but was working closely with those staff and got a good understanding of football, Premier League, and that. So that those 3.5 years were insightful, but I wasn't in it, if that makes sense. I know I wasn't really in it. Then when I went to Aston Villa, I was, in it in the deep end. I think the first, I was in it day to day. The first thing is the Premier League. And even before working within the Premier League, I remember when I was in Australia with you, back in 2010, I remember guys going to the casino at, 12, 1 o'clock to watch Premier League. And you're thinking, wow, that was sort of my first experience of living outside of the UK. And then, I come here to the Middle East and the Premier League's a thing. I've been to parts of Africa, so it's so big, it's so international, and I think only when you come out of it you really understand the scale and the size of it. I suppose like any job, positives and negatives. As a league itself, it's exciting. Any team, the bottom team can beat the top team on their day, which makes it exciting. Opportunity to work with some of the best footballers in the world, athletes in the world, is good. It's pretty well resourced. So you've got generally budget available to set up staffing structures, to implement certain things that maybe you couldn't in other sports, with less resource. So that's nice. It maybe doesn't challenge you in certain respects, but it's nice to be able to do what you want to do and to implement certain things. Premier League's it's a cultural melting pot. You've got guys from all over the world, players and staff. A lot of South American players in the Premier League, African players. You've got a lot of Europeans. So real diversity, and that's nice to be exposed to different viewpoints, people, languages, cultures, etc. So that was a real positive. And then I enjoyed working with players. I enjoy working with young players within Everton. when I went to Villa, there was some young players, transitioning into first team football as well. So 18, 19-year-old players playing at first team level. And then, I've worked with some players sort of 35, 36 years of age. So that real spectrum was quite of player was quite nice to work with as well. Look, it's also a very high pressure environment. It can be difficult at times when you're on a bad run of form. You're in the relegation zone. A manager loses their job. That they're all difficult times and situations as well. The schedule is pretty relentless. For 11 months of the year, you're working generally 6 days a week, and on your day off, sure, you're going to be contacted, or sure, you're going to be doing some sort of work. So for 11 months of the year, you're full tilt, and your weekends are traveling up and down the country to matches. So that could be pretty grueling as well. I suppose from a day to day, from my perspective, anything that a player eats, drinks, or from a supplement perspective, I'm sort of really in charge of. So they come in, typically they'll have breakfast, so overseeing that, training, everything that goes on there, and lunches. So meal times you're around, you're working with different people, obviously the players, the rest of the sports science and medicine team, physios, doctors, S&C, fitness staff, performance directors. You're working closely with catering staff, to make sure menus are adequate, or what they should be for in the training ground for when you travel. So you're working with a lot of different people on different things, and then with the players themselves, you're working on different things as well. Fueling, recovery, hydration, specific supplements. Certain players may be injured, so again, you could be working on different things there. Certain players might have body composition issues. So that's an overview of Premier League from my perspective.
And you mentioned earlier on that you were at Aston Villa, I think during those early COVID years, or at the start of COVID. In that period of time, was the players in a bubble like a lot of other sports were doing? And I guess, did you have complete control over like breakfast, lunch, dinner, everything that they were doing?
Yeah, it was quite a strange time, for everyone. But the Premier League were adamant that the league was going ahead. So it was, I can't quite remember. It was a phase, certainly a phase. It was individual, training at home initially by themselves. Then they were allowed to come into the training ground and train at an individual level. Then it was group training, but there was a lot of testing. There was certain restrictions around what you could and couldn't do from a drinks bottles, I suppose, from a hygiene perspective, so drinks bottles and food. So a lot of it was pre-ordered, pre-packed, etc. You couldn't sit in the canteen, you couldn't have buffet style. A lot of it was around touch points and hygiene and health and safety. So yeah, but it was a challenging time. And then what you had was some players, say foreign players, were in the country by themselves because families had gone back home or whatever. And then if they got COVID, for example, there was a number of times, a number of different players that they got COVID, but they're by themselves. So I end up having to go out and do the shopping for them. And yeah, so it was quite a unique time.
Yeah, wow. It seems again like another learning curve on your sort of path to where you're at now. And from a nutritional perspective, how much emphasis was placed on the nutrition of players at that level of football? Was it something that was deemed really, really important, or was it just, something in the background that I guess was important, but at the end of the day, their overall skill, their strength and conditioning sides of things were more and more important than, I guess, what they were eating? How did it sort of all fit together?
Yeah, I mean, look, football's primarily a skill-based sport. There's physical elements, physical components. So it's, maybe not held, I don't know if it's fair to say held in the same regard, but say something that's more less skill-based, more physiology-based, like an endurance sport, like, endurance running or cycling or something. There's probably a greater emphasis on it. But what I would say is, when I started out, within the Premier League, there was maybe I don't know of any full-time practitioners when I started within any of the clubs. fast forward to today, 24. There's certain clubs that have several full-time staff within a first team. If I think of Tottenham, I think they have 3 full-time staff at the first team. I think they have 3 full-time staff at the academy, and they have a woman. So I think Tottenham Hotspur have about 6 or 7 nutritionists across the club. If you think back, 10, 15 years, it's come on a long way. And I suppose, nutrition within the performance sciences, nutrition is one of the younger and newer disciplines. And I guess it's just taking time for people to understand and appreciate, specifically the stakeholders who hold the purse strings, sporting directors and performance, maybe not performance directors, but those guys at the top level of management who allocate funds and budgets for staffing. I think that there's a real understanding now and appreciation of the role that nutrition can play. So yeah, most clubs have full-time practitioners now. And then I guess if you think of team sport, you've worked a long time in rugby, James, and you'll understand that it's the classic bell-shaped curve, isn't it? You've got some players who couldn't give a shit about nutrition. You've got a lot of players who they accept it, appreciate it, and then you've got some players who are absolutely obsessed with it. That it's, and I would say that's the same in football and rugby and young, old, all the different environments, team sport environments I've worked in, they're all the same. That's the classic bell-shaped curve. But within Premier League, even within the 3 years that I was, or just under 3 years that I was at Aston Villa, by the time I left, I'd say half the squad had private chefs.
Wow.
They were employing their own full-time private chefs. So, those guys were obviously taking it seriously and investing in themselves. So yeah, I think organizations are taking it more seriously. I think players are taking it more seriously. And I guess you probably see that in, you look at the likes of, again, I'm going to use football as the example, but you look at players like Cristiano Ronaldo, Ibrahimovic, that they're playing towards 40 years of age, still at a maybe not the top level, but still at a very good level. Whereas that wasn't the case even 10 years ago. So, and again, I'm not saying it's just nutrition, but it's, they're becoming more professional in their approach with nutrition, with their strengthening and conditioning, with their rest and sleep, just their holistic lifestyle, I suppose.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah. And that, whether that, nutrition might play 10% of it, but it's adding to that longevity of the players. Yeah, it's definitely a big thing. And it's great that there's more buy-in, and great that I guess a lot of clubs are really picking up on it and taking it really seriously. We mentioned earlier on that you have worked in a few different sports. When it comes to nutrition, how does it differ between sports? You've spent a lot of time in football and rugby, and I mentioned also boxing. Is it a one-size-fits-all model, or how do you look at nutrition in sport?
Yeah, good question. I mean, let's talk about team sports. So if we talk about football and rugby, they're intermittent in nature. So the physiology, metabolic demands are not dissimilar. Obviously, football, slightly longer game. Players generally cover more distance, more high-speed running, more sprint distance, more change of directions, that kind of things. Rugby, less running distance and volume, etc. However, there's a hell of a lot more collisions and demand on the musculoskeletal system that way. So yeah, they're not dissimilar. To be honest, there's I think the other thing with football is probably different to rugby is the schedule. It's not, you could play 2 and maybe not 3 games in a week, but you could play 3 games over an 8-day period. Whereas in rugby, you play once a week. I don't know if that's a law, but you can't be bashed in the head too much more than once a week.
Yeah.
So there's slight differences, say, from a recovery perspective in that regard. But then, weight making is quite different. So yeah, I worked for around just under 3 years with Carl Frampton, who's from Belfast. He was a 2-weight world champion. And Carl had been a professional boxer a long time. He had struggled. He'd missed weight in the past, and I got involved with him in his last 5 fights of his career. So the last sort of 2.5, 3 year period of his career, where he just wanted a little bit of help around making weight better. Because obviously, if they don't make weight, they don't get their purse. They don't. They lose their purse, and that's it. So with weight making sports, you want them to make weight in a safe manner. There's some archaic practices within weight making sports, and unfortunately you do get people dying, particularly in MMA, where they try to drastically cut, say 10+% of body weight within very short periods of time, and they drop dead. Severe dehydration and hyponatremia and stuff. So you're trying to get them to make weight in a not an acute period, and sort of over a period of say 10, 12, 14 week camp. But at the same time, you want them to perform in training and perform ultimately on the night. So yeah, the nutrition looks quite different in those regards. But I really enjoyed the weight making side of things. It was because it was so different. And again, I suppose the work I did with Carl was, whilst I saw him maybe a couple, 2, 3 times a month, I wasn't with him all the time. So it was a lot more remote phone calls, WhatsApp, text messages, those kind of things. And I sorted out all his food for him through a meal prep company. So it was quite a different way of working as well when working with that kind of athlete.
When a boxer's trying to cut or lose weight, what are some, I guess, sensible things to do? Is it an idea of cutting carbs, or is it, reducing total calorie intake? I would assume that everyone's different as well, so you might not be one size fits all. But what might a basic program or diet look like for a boxer trying to cut weight?
So what we would always do at the start of a camp, James, would be Carl would get a DEXA scan, and what information that would give us how much fat-free mass he's got, and how much fat mass he's got. So again, the fat mass is the one we want to reduce and manipulate. So how much of that we've got to play with. And the second thing we would do was the RMR, resting metabolic rate assessment. So again, resting metabolic rates, the amount of energy that someone needs to just maintain normal physiology. So we would try never to drop below that. So that would give me an idea of sort of numbers to be working with. Generally let's say, for example, his resting metabolic rate was 1900 or let's say 2000 kilocalories per day. That would be his calorie intake for the day, because obviously he was training on top of that. I would have known he would have been in an energy deficit. So the first thing would be making sure he's in an energy deficit to try to reduce that fat mass. Protein high to try to preserve muscle mass and recover. And then periodized carbohydrates around his training. So he would have always eaten carbohydrate prior to training in the morning. As soon as he'd finished his training and say late morning, his lunchtime, he would have replaced those carbohydrates. And then the second half of the day would have been a lot lower from a carbohydrate perspective. And on a rest day, he would have generally dropped he kept his carbohydrate quite low as well. Probably every 2 weeks, he would have had a free day at the weekend, whilst it might have been a low training day or a nothing day from a calorie expenditure perspective. He needed it psychologically. So that was an agreement we came to. So yeah,
something to look forward to. A bit of pizza or something at the end of the fortnight.
Well, his was a roast Sunday dinner, roast beef with all the trimmings and a dessert. Yeah.
Going back to rugby and football, for example, obviously rugby, the players need to be physically bigger and have more muscle mass compared to football players because of as you mentioned, the collisions. Things like protein intake and stuff and total calorie intake between those two sports. And I guess rugby might change from position perspective, front rowers all the way, out to wingers and fullbacks. Does that differ very much in terms of total protein intake, or does it differ much in terms of the recovery phase, or is recovery similar? And can you shed any light on that aspect?
Yeah, and again, another interesting question. I guess in sport nutrition, a lot of recommendations are prescribed per kilogram of body mass. So a lot of the carbohydrate requirements are done per kilo of body mass, protein the same. So, generally within rugby, football, you probably want your players on a high protein diet. Now that's around 2 grams per kilo generally. So if I'm an 80-kilo player, 2 grams per kilo, 160 grams, and then generally split that across the day. Now, if you're a heavier individual, prop forward in rugby, say you're 120 kilos, as a total amount, that's going to be heavier, but from a relative perspective, it's the same.
Okay.
I suppose from a positional perspective within rugby or football, front row forwards, there's not many front row forwards that play the full match nowadays. A lot of players will play 50, 60 minutes and then that's it. And the running requirements for those guys aren't as much. However, there's a hell of a lot more collisions, and their game is very different to say a scrum half or a back three player. So you might tweak it slightly. But yeah, as I say, a lot of the nutritional requirements nowadays are individualized to body weight. And then, yeah, you would look at positional requirements too, from, say, a fueling perspective.
Okay. And one of the things you mentioned also that you really enjoyed throughout your experience was the fact that you got to work with players from a young age all the way through to players that were, close to retirement, late 30s and that sort of thing. What about nutrition between the youth athletes and senior athletes? Is that the same, or does that differ depending on the ages?
Yeah, I guess, the two environments are just different, I suppose. First team senior environments, winning and performance, that's all that matters. The competition on the weekend. Whereas at academy and youth development, it's longer term development of the player and the person. There's probably more focus that goes into developing the person as well. It's a little bit more holistic within academy setup and system. I suppose from a practitioner perspective as well, before we go into the nutritional differences, is say in football now, you might have 2 or 3 practitioners working with a squad of, say, 30 players. Within academy settings, it's not generally as well resourced. So you might have one practitioner looking after 100 or 120 players. Some academy and youth systems across different sports in the world don't have any nutrition support at all. So, that is different. But I guess, nutritionally, the biggest difference is youth players are growing and developing. And I think we might come on to this is sort of some of the stuff that I looked at within my PhD. But so whilst an adult player is finished that growth and development, you're trying to fuel them, recover them. You're trying to do that at the youth level, but you're also trying to make sure that they grow and mature in a optimal way too. They have massive energy requirements, which again we can discuss. But I guess the other thing is the schedules. Typically, these guys are going to school, say from 9 to 3, but then they're doing the training that a senior adult would do on top of that. So the days are long, 5-6 days a week, and that has challenges from a nutrition perspective. Where are they eating? How are they getting the food? Are they getting it at the right times? Those kind of things. So, and there's a lot more parental influence in nutrition at an academy age. Parents are generally buying the food, they're generally preparing the food. So they have a lot greater influence on the youth athlete compared to, say, a senior player who dictates that more themselves.
Yeah, great. Interesting. I didn't think about that aspect in terms of the parents as well. But you talked about your PhD briefly. Your PhD focused on youth nutrition requirements. What exactly was it that you researched, and what were some of the, I guess, findings?
Yeah, so my PhD, it was an embedded PhD. So when I started the role at Everton, the agreement was I was a full-time practitioner within Everton Academy. They funded my research. So I was embedded in Everton, not as a full-time member of Everton Football Club staff, but as a full-time PhD researcher practitioner. So it was a very much a dual role. So they funded that and set that up. I guess the overarching aim was to investigate the energy requirements of academy footballers as they progress through the academy pathway. So as a 11, 12, 13-year-old comes into the full-time academy system, how does their nutrition and energy requirements change towards the senior level and adult level? And that was probably there was a guy called Liam Anderson who conducted a similar PhD to mine within Liverpool Football Club, but at the first team level. So he did certain studies looking at, right, this is what senior adults. Then mine was sort of building upon that research, but then looking across the academy pathway. So my thesis was made up of 3 studies that were quite descriptive and observational in nature, but answered questions that I suppose needed to be asked to provide more information and insight into the energy requirements. So the first study we did was cross-sectional analysis of body composition and resting metabolic rate. So every player within the academy from under 12 up to under 23, so all the way across the pathway, we give them a DEXA scan to look at body composition. So we found out bone mineral density, fat-free mass, and fat mass. And then they all had, following that, they had a resting metabolic rate scan. So I suppose the key findings from that were obviously players grow in size and height and weight. Most of those weight increases come, again, as you'd expect, from increases in fat-free mass. And surprisingly, there was actually no changes in fat mass, so absolute fat mass, between an under 12 player and a say a senior player, 23 player. So all at around, say, 9-10 kilos of fat. But because the younger players had less fat-free mass or muscle mass, as a percentage body fat, they would appear a lot higher. But it wasn't because they had more fat per se. It was just because of the lack of muscle mass development. So that had implications on body composition monitoring, I suppose, within sort of those younger players. And then I guess the other thing, as you'd expect, is we sort of put some numbers to the increases in fat-free mass also led to increases in resting metabolic rate, obviously with fat-free mass and muscle mass being the most metabolically active tissue. So as you grow, you have a higher energy requirements just to maintain your body and the bigger size. So that was really the first study to quantify changes in body composition and changes in resting energy expenditure. Second study looked at training and match load across the season. Again, across the full academy pathway from 12s up to 23s. So we looked at training load and also match load accumulatively across the week. And academy players generally do the same as first team players from a volume perspective, say total distance or minutes, those kind of things, particularly in the 16s, 17s, 18s. But what you would find is there were certain weeks where academy players would say go to a tournament or a competition and they would have very high weeks, around 35-kilometer weeks, which, I know in Aussie rules, it's probably not a lot, but within football, that's high, particularly for lads who have immature skeletons and doing those high volumes of work. Intensity wasn't as you'd expect, or as you would expect, it's not the level of first team, but from a volume perspective, they were generally doing what adult players would do in certain weeks and in some cases higher. And again, that's, if the nutrition's not right around that, that can lead to some real issues there, particularly from an injury and skeletal injury specifically. And then I suppose one of the other things we found there that there was really a lack of periodization throughout the training week as well, leading into competition, into match day in the younger age groups. So 12s to sort of 16s, lack of periodization, and then the match at the weekend. Whereas under 18s, 23s, they started to periodize like senior footballers. And again, that has implications for nutrition around training and match day. And I guess the The final study was to look at total energy expenditure. So total energy expenditure across 3 different age groups. So we got a grant from UEFA. Some of the Everton money covered this one, and then we got a grant from UEFA, the governing body of European football. And we looked at total energy expenditure in under 12s, under 15s, under 18s. And we did that using a method called doubly labeled water. So I won't go into the intricacies of it, but very expensive technique. It's about £1,000 per player. And I think we did 24 players in total. So eight players from 12s, 8 players from 15s, 8 players from 18s. And what that allows you to do is assess energy expenditure in free living conditions. So the player takes a drink. We then collect urine samples over a 2-week period to be analysed and to give us energy expenditure results. And what we found there, again, is no surprise, but as they grow and as they increase in size and as training load increases, so too does their energy expenditure. So I think our under 12s are averaging around 2,900 calories, give or take, as a mean. Players higher and lower than that, of course. 3,100 around for 15s, and then around 3,500 for the under 18s. But what was quite interesting for us was the real spread in the data. There were some players, I think there was one of the under 18s players that expended 5,500 calories per day. That's on average over that 2-week period. So that's higher than adult footballers. You know, going to the school schedule, the say PE in school, the football schedule, maybe playing with his friends. So if you think of that, then energy expenditure dictates what you should eat from an intake perspective. Then, eating 5,500 calories every day is a hell of a lot of calories, particularly for a smaller kid who maybe can't eat as much. They have limited schedules. So again, that was really quite interesting for us, and highlighted us the real high expenditures. And then I suppose, you know, we've done some subsequent research off the back of that now, where we looked at, okay, what does a Premier League academy player expend compared to an aged match control who's not in that full-time program? And you know, that piece of research that was led by Ruben Stables showed that being in that full-time academy program probably causes about a 750 calorie per day expenditure from that training program. So again, what we're trying to do with all of this research, I suppose, is try to change policy within the Premier League, because within the Premier League academies there is something called EPPP, Elite Player Performance Plan, that dictates staffing and those kind of things. And at the minute, nutrition only has to be part-time. So I suppose what we're trying to do is highlight the importance of nutrition and try to change EPPP policy, I suppose.
Yeah, I guess if you look at some of your results or your findings there, and you mentioned that, you know, some young athletes were expending up to 5,500 or whatever it was calories per day. Had they not been involved in a study like that, how would they have any idea of what sort of intake that they might require? And is there, you know, is there any way, I guess, as an academy nutritionist, that you are able to measure that sort of information?
You know, as I said, James, we used the method we used was sort of the gold standard doubly labeled water technique, but it's not feasible within the field. It's very expensive, and the analysis of it takes a long time. So, you know, it's not really something you use in day-to-day practice. I guess the difficulty with energy expenditure or understanding energy expenditure is that it changes all the time, every day. So if you break down energy expenditure, you've got resting metabolic rate, which is quite stable in most people. Unless you're growing, it increases slightly. But, you know, but activity energy expenditure, so say from me moving now, that's like burning energy, and then football training and rugby training, whatever. Because that's different day to day, it's getting the exact numbers is very difficult. But I think one thing you can do as an academy, say, practitioner, or any practitioner working with say a young athlete, is are they growing? Are they still growing and maturing? So regular height and weight measurements. And then I suppose if they're not, what a young athlete is quite susceptible to, particularly the one that's training at a high level, is low energy availability. And, that's something that's become quite topical within sport nutrition, say, over the last 5-6 years. And low energy availability has many different signs and symptoms. So it can lead to poor bone health, reduced bone mineral density, increased risk of fracture, that kind of thing, delayed growth, delayed maturation, psychologically, poor sleep, irritability, poor mood swings, performance decreases from a strength, power, endurance perspective. So there's different health and performance signs and symptoms, if you like, of low energy availability. So I think being aware of them and alert to them. And I think if you're getting a gauge of growth, height and weight growth, if you have a gauge of their energy intake, a good idea of what they are actually eating, and if you're aware of different signs and symptoms of, say, low energy availability, I think sort of triangulating that data will give you a good understanding of whether they are hitting their energy requirements or not on a daily basis.
Yeah, great. So without the expensive tests that you guys had access to, using some of those, I guess those key factors might be something that just coaches in general, parents of young kids who are playing a lot of sport can look out for to help them gauge, if they're getting enough energy through their diet, or maybe not enough energy in their diet.
Yeah, exactly. And I guess if you think there's some of those expenditures now, I know you do a bit of training and you have an interest in nutrition, like 5,500 calories is a hell of a lot of calories to eat on one day, never mind every day. So, as a parent, as a coach, basic things like making sure they're eating 3 good meals a day with 2 or 3 good snacks as well,
Mm.
not an apple. An apple is not a snack, like a decent snack. So, making sure they're eating meals and snacks regularly throughout the day, 5-6 times. They're not skipping meals, using things like liquid calories, smoothies, shakes, those kind of things. So I think, yeah, they're using some of the information I discussed, just there previously, and making sure they are eating regularly and just tracking growth, being alert to signs and symptoms of low energy availability, and having an idea of their intake is as good a place as any to start.
Yeah, some great tips there. Thanks for that one, Marcus. Now, I'm going to move on to your role now. You're working at Qatar Football. How does this role now differ from some of the other roles you've had?
Yeah, it's interesting. So I guess as I've touched on, James, nutrition or sports nutrition is a relatively young discipline, generally worldwide, and within sport. I then think back to my time working in UK and Ireland, it's actually pretty advanced there, worldwide, like it is in Australia. UK and Australia are probably leading in terms of sport nutrition practice, I would say, within the world. Whereas sports nutrition within sport in Qatar is really starting from scratch. Whilst there has been practitioners here over the years, as an organization, Aspire or within the Qatar Football Association, it's never really been a thing. It's had its own unit or department. So we've only started that within the last couple of years. So I guess we're starting from basics, really. In a lot of ways. Things you would probably take for granted in the past. You have to go back and go, you're back to square one. And I guess in the Middle East as a whole, it's culturally, it's very different and diverse. Food and drink, they're quite social people, but a lot of that revolves around food and drink, and there's a lot of tradition and culture around food and drink as well. I guess in Qatar, there's some very big public health issues, obesity, diabetes. It's a wealthy nation, so there's a high intake of fast food, dessert, sodas, those kind of things. And so I guess there's some big cultural issues, bigger cultural issues and challenges compared to, say, maybe the UK. Yeah, they would be probably some of the biggest differences.
I guess with those differences, does it, I guess culturally different types of food and probably the access to different types of foods as well. How does that impact on I guess the types of or the diet or the menus that you can provide when you compare your time in the UK and Ireland to the Middle East?
Yeah, I mean, interesting question. It's I guess I always come back to just the scientific principles. So for me, the scientific principles don't change. I guess it's the practical application, the solutions. If we take fueling or match day -1 as the example, we want to fuel up and hit say 68 grams per kilo of carbohydrate. Pasta is massive and back home, but they love rice dishes out here. They love things like dates. So it's just, for me, from my perspective, it's just having an understanding of foods and drinks that they like, traditions and habits that they have as a whole, and I suppose just a understanding, and then fitting that knowledge to the scientific principles.
Yeah, and I guess one of the other questions around now working with international teams compared to previously you've worked with club teams which have these long, like you mentioned, an 11-month seasons in the Premier League. Is there differences that you have taken into consideration or?
Yeah, I suppose if you take a Premier League club environment, you might go away for pre-season for, say, maybe a long pre-season trip in the Premier League would be 3 weeks. You might do a 10-day trip, you might do a 2-week trip, but it's never going to be longer than 3 weeks. I guess within the season, even for an away game, you leave the day before a game and you come back the night of, or worst case scenario, you come back the day after. So there's not too much to plan, organize, take with you. Whereas if you take, for example, say the Euros is on at the minute in football, most countries are away there for, if you're successful, say a 5-week period, and then maybe a preparation prior to that. Like we had the Asian Cup in January, February this year, but we were very lucky. It was in Qatar, but we were on camp for 8 weeks, a couple of weeks preparation. And then, so had that been in a different country, it's, as you said, different kettle of fish. I guess there's a lot more, especially if you're going overseas and it's not a home camp or tournament. There's a lot of planning and organization that goes into it, from say a food and drink and nutrition catering, hotel catering perspective. You're dealing with different people, cultures, languages, possibly. I think one of the challenges within nutrition is supplements and customs rules and regulations that can be real challenging depending on where you go. Getting supplements into Qatar is difficult. They have to be Arabic translated, they have to be halal certified. So every country that you go to has different rules, regulations, which can be a challenge. But again, a lot of planning and organization goes into that. And then I suppose certain countries, we were in India for a World Cup qualifier in November. We're only there for 4 days, but again, there's, India as a country is high risk of food hygiene, health, safety issues. So again, your focus is around that, and maybe not, right, let's just get through these 4 days with no illnesses, as opposed to making the food nice and top level. So let's make it safe. So I guess there's loads of different considerations, but they would be some of the different things. And as to go back to the club situation, you might prepare a box, your supplement nutrition box. You go up to Newcastle, you play your game, you come home. And because you're working with the same people, the same kit men, the same logistics guys, you're working with the same chefs who are used to working and cooking food on the bus, that kind of thing. You're generally staying at the same hotels every year, so you build up rapport and relationships with those guys. So yeah, whereas international, generally you're going to different places all the time.
Can there be short-term benefits of nutrition as well as those long-term benefits? I mean, if you've got them for 11 months, have you got long-term targets or long-term goals that you're trying to achieve compared to those shorter-term campaigns?
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, so as you say, 11 months of the year with someone, if we come back to the bell-shaped curve, some players don't care, some players care a lot. Okay, so that's what you're working with. Then within nutrition, you might be working on fueling, you might be working on recovery, you might be working on hydration, body composition. There's a whole host of things you could be working on and focusing on with any of those 30 players. So yes, you have more contact time probably with them over that 11-month season. But what I would say is, say you're with players for an 8-week camp and competition. You're in a hotel and you're with them for 8 weeks, so you do have a lot of time there. The focus might be more acute. It might be around, say, fueling or recovery or hydration. Whereas if I think back to the Asian Cup there, I didn't care about body composition of players. There's certain things I wasn't arsed about. Micronutrient deficiency, wasn't arsed about that. The focus was on fueling, the focus was on hydration, the focus was on recovery. But I guess the context that I'm in Qatar is quite unique because, if I compare it to the situation in Australia, I can imagine most of your soccer players or football players play overseas. Probably the majority of them within the national football team there. Whereas in Qatar, every single player plays in the league here. And the league is only in Doha as a city. So we've got our national team headquarters at Aspire. Everyone's within a 30-40 minute radius of that. So whilst players might be out playing at their club, I could get access to them every day if I wanted to. So it's quite unique in the fact that, yes, we only have camps and competitions like the rest of the teams during FIFA dedicated FIFA windows. However, I can access them outside those windows, whereas, say, the practitioners in Australia, for example, might only be able to do that remotely.
Yeah,
If at all.
Yeah, that was, I guess, going to be one of my questions was, if you only have access to those players in these small windows, and they're getting different advice from a different club somewhere else, and they've got conflicting views or ideas, that might make it really difficult. But it sounds like if in your situation you've got access to those players year round, you can monitor them. You might find that you spend more time with them in certain windows or blocks, but then outside of that, you can still monitor them and keep in contact, and you're still sort of in the frame sort of thing. So that, I guess, helps a lot for you.
Yeah, and I just to add on to that, I guess if you're a practitioner with an international setup, you need to have an open dialogue and communication with the club practitioner.
Yeah.
When I worked at the clubs, there was an open dialogue with the national international team practitioners. It wasn't so much me chasing them, but if I would certainly send them things, give them information if they requested. And here, not all clubs have nutritionists here. When I started, there was none. 3 of the clubs now have nutritionists, but I have an open dialogue and communication with them because if you think about it, really you just want continuity for the player. And if there's differences in opinion or messaging, that's a conversation that needs to be had with the practitioner. So the player isn't confused. We try to just keep continuity and keep it as simple for them as possible.
Okay, great. That's some great information there, Marcus, and I really appreciate your time. One little quick question. You talked a little bit about resting metabolic rates. What's the difference, or is it the same, a resting metabolic rate as a basal metabolic rate? Is it the same thing, slightly different?
Yeah. Yeah. I think technically a basal metabolic rate is done straight after sleeping within no movement, because obviously any movement drives your metabolism. Resting metabolic rate is typically still under the same conditions as when you're fasted, you've not done exercise in the, say, 12 hours prior to, but your resting metabolic rate assessment, you might have traveled to a lab or a university or something to get that done, and might be a very, very small bit larger than a BMR, but people talk about them interchangeably. They're essentially the same thing.
Okay. And last question, you mentioned supplements a few times. How much emphasis do you put on supplements as a sports nutritionist, or is it whole foods first, and then supplements are just sort of fill gaps somewhere along the line if needed?
Look, I think even when the diet is optimal from a food perspective, completely optimal, there's still performance and ergogenic benefits from certain supplements. I think the likes of creatine. Now, yes, you can get creatine in very small amounts in food, but if you want to have the ergogenic effect, you need to supplement. Maybe something like more convenient. If you think of a recovery powder, so a protein and carbohydrate powder that someone takes after training, yes, you could probably do that through food, but it's maybe more palatable to have as a shake, and B, maybe more convenient as well. So I think there's a time and a place for supplements for a number of different reasons. Obviously, clinical deficiencies as well, be it vitamin D or iron or whatever. There's obviously a clinical need there and a performance rationale. I think the thing to consider with supplements is if you're tested athletes, which, all the athletes I've worked with in the past have been, supplements are safe to take. So they're tested independently by a third party, testing program, and they're not contaminated in any way. So I think, and what I would say is, we try in the younger players I work with, there's not a huge emphasis and focus on supplements. Generally, that's more at the senior level. But, I think, yes, there's benefits to be had from supplements if the right supplements are taken in the right way, but it has to be safe.
Right. Beautiful. Well, Marcus, I really, really appreciate your time to come on and have a chat and give us all this information about your career and a lot of your expertise in sports nutrition. So thanks so much, mate, for coming on. When is, I guess, your next big tournament with the Qatar team, or whether it be the senior team or the youth teams? What are you sort of building up towards?
Yeah, so we had the Asian Cup there in January, February, which is sort of every 4 years. We actually managed to win that, so that's back to back. So we're now focused on qualification for the World Cup in 2026, which is in Canada, US, Mexico. So we go back into the next round of World Cup qualification in September. So yeah, hopefully this time next year we can be qualified for that. Our under 20s start up again in a few weeks. So they have under 20 Asian Cup. They're building towards that. And our under 17s are building towards their Asian Cup and World Cup next year. So yeah, we've a few bits going on.
Awesome. Well, good luck with all of those things that are coming up. And again, mate, thank you so much. Really appreciate your time. And it's, again, really good to catch up with you on a friendship level, as well as finding out some really important information from you as well, mate.
Yeah, well, thanks for having me on, James. And yeah, good to catch up.
Marcus has a wealth of experience in a number of sports, and we could see how important nutrition has become in elite sport over the last 10 to 15 years. Marcus has a strong research background, and his knowledge around the needs of youth athletes is extremely important because they are the stars of the future, and with increased training demands of youth athletes, nutrition becomes vital in keeping them fit and healthy and on the pathway. I loved hearing about Marcus's experiences in the Premier League. It is such a big sporting competition. Finally, Marcus's experience across sports like boxing, where weight management for weight classes is so important. It's great to hear really clear and sensible explanations in order for these sorts of athletes to make weight and remain fit and healthy and ready for competition. I hope you've enjoyed the episode today. If so, please like it, leave a comment, and pass it on to your coaching colleagues.